The quarterly board meeting should have been Naomi Harrington's victory lap. Instead, at precisely 4:47 p.m. on a rain-threatening Friday in October, it became her public execution. She stood at the head of the mahogany table in Whitmore Capital's executive boardroom, 40 pairs of eyes tracking her every gesture as she presented the Q3 financials, record profits, another quarter of strategic restructuring that had saved the company millions. The numbers glowed on the screen behind her, irrefutable proof that the first black woman CFO in the firm's 90-year history wasn't just competent, she was exceptional. "As you can see," Naomi said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 25 years earning every syllable of respect, "the emerging markets division has exceeded projections by 18%. The cost optimizations implemented in Q2 are yielding exactly the returns projected, and our debt-to-equity ratio has improved significantly." She was 48 years old, striking in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of power without shouting it, her natural hair styled in an elegant twist that had taken her years to wear confidently in these rooms. Her dark eyes swept the board members with practiced assessment, noting who was engaged, who was already mentally checked out for the weekend, who was texting under the table, and who was watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with the numbers on the screen. Preston Whitmore sat at the opposite end of the table in the CEO's chair, his father's chair, his grandfather's chair, looking every inch the legacy heir in his bespoke Navy suit. At 52, he still had the preppy handsomeness of his Connecticut boarding school days, sandy hair graying at the temples in a way that magazine profiles called distinguished. His blue eyes were fixed on Naomi with an expression she'd learned to read over their 15 years of working together. Respect mixed with resentment, admiration tangled with something darker he refused to acknowledge. "Thank you, Ms. Harrington," Preston said, his tone crisp with the particular accent of old money trying to sound democratic. "Those are certainly impressive numbers." Naomi heard the but coming before he voiced it. She'd been hearing it her entire career, the subtle dismissals, the qualifications that followed every achievement, the ways men like Preston acknowledged her brilliance while simultaneously diminishing it. "However," Preston continued, standing smoothly, "before we celebrate, there's a matter that requires the board's immediate attention." Naomi's spine straightened imperceptibly. Something was wrong. The energy in the room shifted like a weather change. Board members sitting up straighter, exchanging glances, confusion rippling across their faces. Preston nodded to Richard Hayes, the general counsel, who'd been sitting unnaturally still throughout Naomi's presentation. Richard stood, his discomfort visible in the tightness around his mouth as he avoided Naomi's gaze. "It has come to our attention," Richard began, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of a lawyer delivering bad news, "that there are financial irregularities requiring investigation. Specifically, unauthorized fund transfers and confidential documents accessed outside normal protocols." The words hit Naomi like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. 25 years of being the only black face, the only woman, the only person in rooms like this who'd had to be twice as good to get half as far. She'd learned to school her features into perfect composure even when the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. "I'm sorry." "What?" she said quietly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline suddenly flooding her system. "What irregularities?" But Preston was already speaking, his voice carrying across the boardroom with devastating efficiency. "Naomi Harrington, effective immediately, you are suspended from your position as Chief Financial Officer, pending a complete investigation of these allegations. You're to surrender your company credentials, remove yourself from all systems, and have no contact with Whitmore Capital employees or files until this matter is resolved." The silence that followed was absolute. 40 executives frozen in shock. No one moved, no one spoke. The rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally began, drops hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows with soft, relentless rhythm. "Preston," Naomi's voice cut through the silence, not pleading, not defensive, just his name, weighted with 15 years of history, carrying a warning he was too far gone to hear. "You don't want to do this." His jaw tightened. For just a moment something flickered in those blue eyes, doubt perhaps, or the ghost of the grudging respect they'd built over years of working together. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold authority of a man who'd inherited power and confused it with wisdom. "Security will escort you out," he said. "You have 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings." Thomas Ashford, the SVP of Legacy Operations, was already standing by the door with 2 security guards. Naomi caught the flash of satisfaction in Thomas's eyes and understood immediately. This wasn't about financial irregularities. This was about the confidential restructuring proposal she'd submitted to the board 3 weeks ago, the one that would have closed Thomas's entire division while saving 800 jobs and repositioning the company for sustainable growth. Someone had leaked it. Someone had framed it as a hostile takeover, and Preston, in his arrogance and insecurity, had believed it. Naomi gathered her tablet and phone with deliberate calm. She looked at each board member in turn. Some couldn't meet her eyes, others watched with poorly concealed curiosity. A few, the ones she'd mentored, the ones who knew her worth, looked stricken. Jordan Chen, the young VP of Operations, was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. When her gaze finally returned to Preston, she let him see exactly what he'd done. Not anger, not fear, just cold, clear assessment of a man who'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. Not a threat, a fact. Then Naomi Harrington walked out of the boardroom that had been her battlefield and her kingdom for 25 years, flanked by security guards, while 40 executives watched in silence, and Preston Whitmore convinced himself he'd done the right thing. The elevator doors closed on her composed face. The rain continued to fall. And somewhere in the building's depths, a clock chimed 5 o'clock, marking the beginning of the weekend that would change everything. As Naomi rode the elevator down 43 floors, her mind cataloged the journey that had brought her to this moment with the same methodical precision she applied to financial analysis. 1999. 23 years old, fresh from Howard University with an accounting degree and a chip on her shoulder the size of Southeast D.C. where she'd grown up. Her father, Malcolm Harrington, had worked 2 jobs, postal worker by day, security guard by night, to send her to college, the first in their family to get a degree. The weight of that sacrifice had driven every decision since. Whitmore Capital had hired her as an accounting clerk in the audit department, entry-level, grunt work. She'd taken the position knowing what everyone else saw, a diversity hire to fill quotas, to check boxes, to make the old money white firm look progressive in its recruiting brochures. She'd worked harder than anyone in that building. Night shifts while completing her MBA at Georgetown, weekends analyzing financial statements that other people dismissed as routine. She learned not just the numbers, but the stories behind them, how companies succeeded, how they failed, where the bodies were buried in balance sheets and cash flow statements. By 2003, she was a senior analyst. By 2006, a manager. By 2008, when the financial crisis hit and Whitmore Capital was hemorrhaging money along with everyone else, Naomi had been the one to identify the toxic assets in their portfolio and develop the strategy to minimize losses. The old man, Preston Whitmore Sr., had noticed. He'd promoted her to Director of Financial Planning in 2009, over the objections of the executive team who thought she was too young and too aggressive. Code words she'd learned to translate: too black, too female, too unwilling to smile and nod while men with half her intelligence made decisions. Preston Whitmore Jr. returned from his MBA at Wharton to begin his ascension to the throne. 37 years old, handsome and polished, and utterly convinced that his pedigree meant more than actual competence. He looked at Naomi, by then a VP, with barely concealed skepticism. Another one of his father's progressive experiments. Their first meeting had been a battle disguised as a strategy session. Preston had presented a plan to expand into European markets. Naomi had calmly demolished it with data, pointing out the currency risks he'd ignored, the regulatory challenges he'd glossed over, the cultural assumptions that betrayed his lack of actual international experience. He'd hated her for it, and respected her for it. The duality had defined their relationship ever since. Preston Sr. died of a heart attack in his office, and his son inherited the CEO position along with the burden of a legendary father's shadow. At the funeral, the old man's attorney had pulled Naomi aside. "He wanted you to know," the attorney said quietly, that you're the reason this company survived the last decade. He was working on changing his succession plan to give you more authority. He ran out of time. Naomi had grieved not just for the man who'd believed in her, but for the opportunity that died with him. Under Preston Jr.'s leadership, Whitmore Capital had been adequate, not terrible, not innovative, just adequate. He'd maintained relationships, kept existing clients happy, avoided major disasters. But the industry was changing. Fintech disrupting traditional models, younger firms moving faster, and Preston responding with caution that looked more like paralysis. Naomi had compensated, quietly restructuring divisions, streamlining operations, identifying new revenue streams. The board knew it. Preston knew it. The entire executive team knew that the CFO was doing half the CEO's job while he attended conferences and gave interviews about legacy leadership. The resentment had grown between them like a living thing. In meetings, when Naomi challenged his decisions, Preston's jaw would tighten in that particular way that meant she'd hit too close to the truth. When she presented strategic recommendations, he'd praise them publicly and then quietly ignore them, implementing watered-down versions that missed the point entirely. But there was something else beneath the professional tension, something neither of them acknowledged, the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way her pulse quickened when he leaned close to examine documents over her shoulder. The charged silence that fell between them in late-night strategy sessions, alone in the executive suite with rain on the windows and the city glowing below. They'd been circling each other for years, respect and resentment, and something far more dangerous that neither would name. 3 weeks ago, Naomi had made her move. She'd prepared a comprehensive restructuring proposal that would transform Whitmore Capital from a legacy firm coasting on its reputation into a lean, innovative company positioned for the next decade. It required closing Preston Sr.'s original division, the one his grandfather had founded, the one Thomas Ashford now ran into the ground with spectacular incompetence while trading on old families' connections. She'd submitted it to the board confidentially, knowing Preston would resist, hoping the directors would overrule him for the company's good. Instead, someone had leaked it, twisted it, made it look like Naomi was orchestrating a coup, positioning herself to take over, betraying the Whitmore family legacy. And Preston, in his pride and his insecurity and his willful blindness to everything that truly threatened the company, had suspended her in front of 40 witnesses without even asking for her side of the story. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened onto the marble lobby where Naomi had entered as a 23-year-old clerk 25 years ago. Security was waiting to collect her credentials. She handed over her badge, her building access card, her company laptop, kept her personal phone and tablet, walked out the front doors into October rain with her head high and her mind already working 3 moves ahead. Preston Whitmore thought he'd neutralized a threat. What he'd actually done was declare war on the only person who could save him. And Naomi Harrington had never lost a war she'd chosen to fight. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of brilliant autumn sunshine that felt like mockery. Naomi stood in the kitchen of her Georgetown brownstone, purchased 10 years ago with money she'd earned through brilliance and strategic investments, brewing coffee with methodical precision while her mind ran scenarios. The doorbell rang at 7:30 a.m. She checked the security camera and smiled despite everything. Her father had a key, but Malcolm Harrington was old school enough to ring the bell on weekend mornings out of respect for her space. Baby girl. Malcolm swept into the kitchen with the energy of a man 20 years younger than his 74 years. Retired now from the Postal Service, he still maintained the upright bearing of someone who'd worked 2 jobs for 20 years without complaint. His brown face was creased with concern beneath his silver hair. I'm going to need you to explain to me why my daughter, who has more integrity in her pinky finger than most people have in their whole body, got perp walked out of her office yesterday. Good morning to you too, Daddy. Naomi poured him coffee, extra cream the way he'd taken it for 50 years. You saw the news? Jordan Chen called me last night. That boy was beside himself. Said Preston Whitmore suspended you in front of the whole board without even letting you speak. Malcolm's voice carried the particular edge of a father whose child has been wronged. Want me to go down there and explain some things to Mr. Princeton? It's Wharton, and no. Naomi handed him the coffee and gestured to the kitchen table where she'd already spread out her laptop, legal pads, and 3 folders of documentation. I need you to sit down and let me walk you through what's about to happen. Malcolm studied her face. The calm determination he'd seen there since she was 6 years old, announcing she was going to be important someday, and settled into the chair. You've got a plan. I've got 3 plans, contingency plans for each, and backup documentation for all of it. Naomi sat across from him, her weekend attire of jeans and a Howard University sweatshirt, making her look younger, but her eyes carrying the steel of someone who'd spent 25 years playing chess while others played checkers. Preston thinks he suspended me for financial irregularities. What he actually did was trigger a series of events he doesn't understand. She walked Malcolm through it systematically. The restructuring proposal, Thomas Ashford's embezzlement, because that's what the irregularities actually were, she was certain, carefully framed to implicate her. The board dynamics, and most importantly, the trusts and performance clauses that governed Whitmore Capital's ownership structure. Preston's father didn't just leave him the company, Naomi explained. He left it in a trust with specific performance requirements. Missed targets for 3 consecutive quarters and emergency provisions activate. The board can transfer controlling interest to someone who can demonstrate the capacity to restore performance. Malcolm's eyebrows rose. And let me guess, Preston's about to miss his 3rd quarter. He would have. I've been compensating, but my restructuring proposal showed the board exactly how bad things really are. Thomas leaked it to make me look like a threat. Preston suspended me. And now, Naomi smiled, sharp and cold. Now there's no one to save him from his own mediocrity. So you're going to let him fail? I'm going to let him face the consequences of his choices. There's a difference. Naomi's phone buzzed, the first of many calls she'd been expecting. Her attorney, Sandra Washington, a Howard classmate who'd built a practice representing executives in corporate disputes. I need to take this. The conversation was brief and professional. Sandra had reviewed the suspension documentation, found multiple procedural violations, and was prepared to file suit if necessary. But she agreed with Naomi's assessment. Litigation was the amateur move. There was a much more elegant solution available. The second call came from Robert Chen, a forensic accountant Naomi had worked with on previous investigations. I need you to look into Thomas Ashford's division, she told him. Every transaction for the last 18 months. I think you're going to find that the financial irregularities Preston's so concerned about have nothing to do with me. The third call was the most important. Naomi stared at the contact name for a full minute before dialing. Vivian Whitmore. Preston's mother answered on the second ring, her cultured voice carrying decades of Boston Brahmin breeding. Naomi, I was wondering when you'd call. Mrs. Whitmore? Vivian, please. We're past formalities. A pause waited with meaning. I assume you're calling about my son's spectacular display of poor judgment yesterday. Despite everything, Naomi felt a smile tug at her lips. Vivian Whitmore was 78 years old, a board member since her husband's death, and possessed the kind of clear-eyed pragmatism that her son had unfortunately not inherited. I'd like to discuss the company's situation, Naomi said carefully. If you have time this weekend. My dear, I have nothing but time, and a considerable amount of regret that my son inherited his father's business, but not his ability to recognize genuine excellence when it's carrying his company on its back. Vivian's tone sharpened. Come to my penthouse at 4 o'clock. Bring documentation. We have a great deal to discuss. Vivian Whitmore's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a pre-war building in DuPont Circle, all high ceilings and original crown molding and the kind of understated wealth that never needed to announce itself. Naomi had been there twice before, once for a company holiday party, once for Preston Sr.'s wake, but never like this. Never as a potential ally in what amounted to a corporate coup. The housekeeper ushered her into a library that smelled of leather and old books and the particular must of inherited privilege. Vivian sat in a wing-back chair by the window, afternoon light illuminating her silver hair and the sharp intelligence in her blue eyes, the ones her son had inherited along with everything else. Naomi, Vivian gestured to the opposite chair. Sit. Tell me what my son has done this time. Naomi settled into the chair and opened her tablet, but before she could begin her prepared presentation, Vivian raised a hand. No. Before the data, before the strategies, I want you to tell me something honestly. The older woman leaned forward. Did you access funds inappropriately or share confidential documents without authorization? No, ma'am. Of course you didn't. My son is many things. Charming, well-meaning, occasionally even competent, but he's also insecure enough to believe that anyone who challenges him must be a threat. Vivian's mouth tightened. His father worried about that. Preston always needed to be the smartest person in the room, even when he clearly wasn't. Mrs. Whitmore. Vivian. The older woman's tone brooked no argument. Now show me what you've brought. Naomi walked her through everything. The restructuring proposal, which Vivian read with increasing approval. The evidence suggesting Thomas Ashford's embezzlement, carefully documented by Robert Chen's preliminary findings. The pattern of Preston's decisions that had led to declining performance, and finally, the trust structure that governed the company's ownership. I didn't know about the performance clauses until recently, Naomi admitted. Jordan Chen mentioned them in passing 6 months ago. I started researching. Vivian smiled, sharp and knowing. My husband put those provisions in place, specifically because he worried about Preston. He loved our son, but he wasn't blind to his limitations. He told me once, shortly before he died, that you were the future of Whitmore Capital, that Preston would need to learn to follow your lead, or the company wouldn't survive. The words hit Naomi harder than she expected. Validation from beyond the grave, from the man who'd believed in her when no one else would. The trust provisions activate after 3 consecutive quarters of declining performance, Vivian continued, pulling a file from the table beside her chair. We're currently on quarter 2. Preston's suspension of you, his chief financial officer, the person who's been compensating for his poor decisions, virtually guarantees we'll miss Q4 targets. Which means emergency measures activate in January, Naomi finished. Precisely. Vivian handed her the file. This is documentation of every decision Preston overruled against your recommendation, every strategic proposal he ignored, every quarter you saved through what my son probably thinks of as just doing your job, but was actually extraordinary intervention. Naomi scanned the documents, her pulse quickening. This was more than ammunition. This was proof that she'd been running the company's financial operations at a level that went far beyond a CFO's normal duties. Proof that Preston had been failing and she'd been compensating. Proof that the board would need to act to protect shareholders. Why are you giving me this? Naomi asked quietly. Vivian met her eyes. Because my son needs to learn that legacy means nothing without the people who sustain it. Because Whitmore Capital survives or dies based on the decisions we make in the next 6 weeks. And because, frankly, I like you a great deal more than I like watching my son destroy my husband's life's work through arrogance and insecurity. If we do this, if the board transfers control, it will humiliate him. Yes, Vivian's voice was steel wrapped in silk, and perhaps humiliation is exactly what Preston needs to finally grow up. He's 52 years old, Naomi. He's been coasting on his father's legacy and your competence for 15 years. It's time he learned what real leadership looks like. Naomi studied the older woman. You understand that this changes everything. The family company will survive under your leadership instead of dying under his. Vivian leaned back, her expression softening slightly. My husband built something extraordinary. My son has been a competent caretaker, but you, Naomi, you're a visionary. You see what this company could be, not just what it's been. That's what we need. They spent the next 2 hours going through strategy. Vivian had relationships with key board members, the gravitas of the Whitmore name, and most importantly, the authority as trustee to trigger the emergency provisions. Naomi had the documentation, the strategic vision, and the moral high ground. By the odd arts time Naomi left at 6:30, the October sun setting over Georgetown in brilliant orange. They had a plan. A devastating, elegant, absolutely necessary plan that would reshape Whitmore Capital's power structure before Preston even understood what was happening. As Naomi walked to her car, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Harrington, this is Jordan Chen. I have emails that show Thomas manipulating the timeline on the financials. I know you told me not to contact you, but I can't watch this happen. Call me when you can." Naomi smiled. Even in suspension, she was building an army. Preston Whitmore stood in his penthouse apartment Saturday night, expensive scotch in hand, staring at the DC skyline without really seeing it. His COO and closest friend, David Martinez, sat on the leather sofa behind him, radiating disapproval. "You going to explain what happened yesterday?" David asked. "Because I've gotten about 40 calls from board members and none of them make you look good, Preston." "I suspended my CFO for financial irregularities." Preston took a drink, the scotch burning without providing any comfort. "It's straightforward. Except for the part where you didn't let her defend herself, or the part where you did it in front of the entire board like some kind of corporate execution." David's voice carried the particular frustration of someone who'd been friends with Preston since Wharton and was therefore allowed to be blunt. "That's not like you, man. What really happened?" Preston turned to face him. David was 48, sharp and competent and Latino, in a company that had taken decades to diversify its leadership. He'd been one of Naomi's champions, actually, had told Preston more than once that the CFO was the best thing that ever happened to Whitmore Capital. "Thomas brought me evidence," Preston said. "Fund transfers that Naomi authorized without proper documentation, access to confidential restructuring files. He made a case that she was positioning herself for a takeover." "And you believed Thomas Ashford?" David's eyebrows rose. "The guy who's been running legacy operations into the ground for 3 years? The guy whose division Naomi's been trying to close because it's hemorrhaging money?" "He had documentation. He had motivation," David interrupted. "Preston, think about this for 2 seconds. Naomi Harrington has been at this company for 25 years. She's saved your ass more times than I can count. And suddenly, right after she submits a restructuring proposal that would eliminate Thomas's division, she's embezzling? That's the story you're buying?" Preston set down his glass harder than necessary. "It's not about buying a story. It's about fiduciary responsibility. It's about ego." David stood, his voice hardening. "It's about the fact that Naomi challenged you in that board meeting 2 weeks ago, pointed out that your European expansion plan had holes, and you hated that she was right. Again. So when Thomas handed you an excuse to sideline her, you took it." "That's not—" Preston stopped, took a breath. "I did my due diligence." "Did you?" David pulled out his phone, scrolled, turned the screen to face Preston. "Because I spent today reviewing the evidence Thomas gave you. The transfers Naomi supposedly authorized. They have her digital signature, but the timestamp shows they were processed at 2 a.m. on a Thursday. You know what Naomi does at 2 a.m. on Thursdays?" Preston didn't answer. "She's at her father's house in Southeast. Thursday night is dinner with Malcolm, has been for 25 years. She's never missed it." David pocketed his phone. "So either she drove back to the office in the middle of the night to embezzle funds, or someone with access to her credentials did this and made it look like her." The words settled over Preston like cold water. He walked to his desk, pulled up the evidence file he'd reviewed yesterday, looked at it with fresh eyes, without the anger and resentment that had been clouding his judgment. The timestamps, the access patterns, the way the evidence was just obvious enough to be found, but not so obvious as to be immediately suspicious. It was too neat, too perfect. "You think Thomas framed her," Preston said slowly. "I think Thomas has been stealing from legacy operations for over a year, and Naomi was getting close to finding it. I think her restructuring proposal would have exposed everything, and I think he manipulated you, used your resentment of her, your insecurity about her competence, your pride, to eliminate the threat." Preston felt something cold unfold in his chest. "If that's true, then you just suspended the one person who could save this company and handed Thomas exactly what he wanted." David's voice softened slightly. "Preston, I've known you for 20 years. You're not a bad guy, but you've been so focused on living up to your father's legacy that you missed what was actually threatening it, and it wasn't Naomi." After David left, Preston sat alone in the darkness, reviewing everything. The evidence, the timeline, the pattern of decisions he'd made over the past year, overruling Naomi's recommendations, dismissing her concerns about legacy operations, avoiding the difficult conversations about the company's direction because facing them meant admitting his leadership was failing. He'd suspended her at 4:47 p.m. yesterday, 41 hours ago. In that time, how many calls had she made? How many allies had she contacted? How many contingency plans had she activated? Naomi Harrington was the smartest person Preston had ever worked with. She was also the most strategic. If he'd made a mistake, if Thomas had manipulated him into attacking her, then she wasn't sitting at home wallowing in humiliation. She was planning her countermove. Preston pulled up her contact on his phone, stared at it. He'd had Naomi's personal cell for 15 years, had never called it outside of business emergencies. But this was an emergency, even if not the kind he'd anticipated. He dialed. The call went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. She'd blocked him. Preston sat in his darkened penthouse, expensive scotch forgotten, staring at his phone and realizing with growing dread that he'd made the worst mistake of his professional life. And possibly his personal one too. Because beneath all the professional tension, beneath the resentment and competition and power struggles, there had been something else between him and Naomi. Something he'd been too cowardly to examine. The way his pulse quickened when she walked into board meetings, the way he found excuses to stay late when she was working. The way every challenge she threw at him felt less like conflict and more like the most interesting conversation he'd ever have. He'd been half in love with Naomi Harrington for years and too terrified of what that meant to admit it. Terrified of what it said about him that he needed her professionally. Terrified of what it said about his privilege that he wanted her personally. Terrified of everything that making space for her, really making space for her, not just tolerance but genuine partnership, would require him to surrender. So he'd suspended her instead, chosen the comfortable lie that she was a threat rather than face the uncomfortable truth that she was essential, that he needed her, that the company needed her, that he wanted her in ways that had nothing to do with quarterly reports and everything to do with the way her mind worked, the dignity she carried, the quiet power that filled every room she entered. Preston looked at his phone again, at her contact information, at the blocked call symbol. Monday morning suddenly felt very far away and much too close. Chapter 2. Naomi's phone rang at 8:15 a.m. Sunday morning with the call she'd been waiting for. Robert Chen, forensic accountant, voice tight with the excitement of someone who'd just found exactly what he'd suspected. "You were right," Robert said without preamble. "Thomas Ashford has been embezzling from legacy operations for 18 months. Shell companies, fabricated vendor contracts, the whole playbook. He's taken approximately $3.2 million. Naomi set down her coffee, her mind already racing. "You can prove it?" "I can prove it, trace it, and testify to it." The man wasn't even particularly sophisticated about it. He just assumed no one would look carefully at legacy operations because of the Whitmore family history. Robert paused. "There's more. The financial irregularities that Preston suspended you for, they're Thomas's transactions, but he manipulated the digital signatures to make them appear to come from your credentials. Can you prove that too?" "Already did. The access timestamps don't match your known location or device patterns. Any decent IT forensic team will confirm it." Robert's voice carried grim satisfaction. "Naomi, this isn't embezzlement. This is fraud, identity theft, and corporate sabotage. Thomas Ashford is going to prison." After the call, Naomi sat at her kitchen table reviewing the documentation Robert would be sending. 25 years of playing by the rules, of being twice as good to get half as far, of maintaining perfect integrity while men like Thomas stole with impunity because they traded on family connections and old boy networks. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a text from Jordan Chen. "Can we talk? I have information Preston needs to see." Naomi called him. Jordan answered on the first ring, his young voice strained with obvious stress. "Ms. Harrington, I know you're not supposed to have contact with employees." "Jordan, breathe. What do you have?" "Emails." He exhaled shakily. "I've been going through my archives. I save everything, paranoid habit, and I found a chain between Thomas Ashford and someone in IT from 6 weeks ago. Thomas was asking about access protocols, digital signature verification, whether the system logged secondary access to credentials. The IT guy thought he was asking for security audit purposes. He was planning this, Naomi said quietly. He knew I was getting close to finding his embezzlement, knew my restructuring proposal would expose everything. So he started building the frame 6 weeks ago. There's more, Jordan's voice dropped. I have an email from Thomas to Preston from 2 months ago. Thomas CC'd me accidentally, then recalled it, but I'd already read it. He was telling Preston that you were overreaching your authority and positioning yourself to undermine the CEO. He was planting seeds. Naomi closed her eyes. This was more systematic than she'd thought. Thomas hadn't just framed her for his crimes. He'd been running a months-long campaign to make Preston suspicious of her, to prime him to believe the worst when the evidence appeared. And Preston, in his insecurity and his resentment, had fallen for it completely. Jordan, why are you helping me? Naomi asked. You could stay quiet, keep your head down, protect your position. Because 3 years ago, when I presented my operational efficiency proposal in my first board meeting, every executive in that room dismissed it. Except you. Jordan's voice steadied. You stayed after, asked to see my full analysis, and then you championed it. You taught me that doing what's right matters more than doing what's comfortable. Now it's my turn. This could cost you your job. Then I'll find another job with my integrity intact. He paused. Besides, Ms. Harrington, you taught me something else. Always bet on excellence, and you're the definition of excellence. After they hung up, Naomi stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the Sunday morning quiet of Georgetown. The pieces were falling into place. Robert's forensic evidence, Jordan's emails, Vivian's documentation of Preston's failures, her own strategic restructuring plan that the board had been quietly reviewing. She could take this evidence to the authorities, clear her name, and return to her CFO position. Let Preston and the board deal with Thomas, return to the status quo. But the status quo had just suspended her in front of 40 witnesses because a mediocre white man's insecurity mattered more than her 25 years of excellence. The status quo meant being essential but never truly valued, carrying companies on her back while less capable men took credit and collected corner offices. Naomi Harrington was done with the status quo. She opened her laptop and began drafting the presentation that would change everything. Sunday afternoon, Naomi sat in her home office reviewing the complete strategic package. Not just evidence of Thomas's crimes, not just documentation of Preston's failures. A comprehensive plan for Whitmore Capital's future that would make her indispensable to the board. Her restructuring proposal, refined, expanded, and backed by 5 years of performance data showing exactly how her strategic interventions had saved the company. Analysis of emerging market opportunities that Preston had ignored. A leadership transition plan that would position Whitmore Capital for sustainable growth. And the coup de grace, documentation of the trust performance clauses, board voting structures, and shareholder agreements that would allow the board to transfer controlling interest to someone who could demonstrate superior capacity to lead the company forward. Someone like the CFO who'd been carrying the CEO's incompetence for 15 years. Naomi could have cleared her name quietly, could have returned to her position and continued being the power behind Preston's throne. But she was 48 years old, had spent a quarter-century proving herself in rooms that should have welcomed her, and she was done making men comfortable while they took credit for her brilliance. If Preston wanted to suspend her without investigation, without trust, without even a conversation, after 15 years of working together, then she would show him exactly what his arrogance had cost him. Her phone rang. Sandra Washington, her attorney. I've reviewed everything, Sandra said. The forensic evidence, the emails, the trust documentation. Naomi, you could own this company by Monday morning if you move correctly. That's the plan. It's going to be brutal. Preston will be humiliated. The press will have a field day, and you'll be making enemies of every man who's ever felt threatened by a competent woman. So, business as usual? Naomi's voice carried dry humor. Sandra laughed despite the gravity. Fair point. Do you want to do this? Naomi thought about her father working 2 jobs so she could go to college, about being the first black woman CFO in a 90-year-old firm, about every room where she'd been the only one, every decision where she'd had to be perfect while men like Preston could fail upward, every moment where her excellence had been treated as threat instead of asset. "Yes," she said simply. "I want to do this." They spent the next hour finalizing strategy. The evidence would be presented to the board simultaneously with the restructuring proposal and documentation of the trust provisions. Vivian would call an emergency Monday morning board meeting. By the time Preston understood what was happening, the vote would be underway. After Sandra hung up, Naomi drafted one more document, her opening statement to the board, not defensive, not emotional, just a clear, devastating presentation of facts that would make the path forward undeniable. Her phone buzzed with a text from Vivian. "Everything is arranged. 8 a.m. emergency board meeting. Preston will be expecting to present his investigation findings. He'll get something else entirely." Naomi typed back, "Thank you for this." Vivian's response came immediately. "Don't thank me. Make my husband's company into everything it should be. That will be thanks enough." Naomi looked at the materials spread across her desk. Evidence, strategy, documentation, 25 years of excellence distilled into presentations that would reshape a company's power structure in a single morning. Preston Whitmore had no idea what was coming, and that, Naomi reflected with grim satisfaction, was exactly the point. Sunday evening, Preston sat in his home office reviewing the suspension documentation for the 4th time. David's words from yesterday wouldn't stop echoing. "You just suspended the one person who could save this company." The evidence against Naomi looked increasingly thin under scrutiny. The timestamps, it didn't match her patterns. The transactions were too obvious. And Thomas Ashford's eagerness to present the evidence, to push for immediate suspension without investigation, suddenly seemed less like diligence and more like desperation. Preston had built his career on his father's legacy, had inherited leadership of Whitmore Capital not through achievement, but through birthright. He'd always known he wasn't the visionary his father had been, but he'd told himself that steady leadership, that maintaining relationships and avoiding disasters was enough. Naomi had been showing him for 15 years that it wasn't. Every strategic recommendation he'd dismissed because it felt too aggressive. Every restructuring proposal he'd watered down because it challenged tradition. Every quarterly report where her footnotes and contingency plans had compensated for his conservative approach that bordered on paralysis. She'd been carrying him, carrying the company, and instead of gratitude or partnership, he'd responded with resentment. Because admitting that he needed Naomi Harrington, that the company needed her more than it needed him, was unbearable. It meant acknowledging that his name and his pedigree and his father's legacy weren't enough. That excellence mattered more than inheritance. That the black woman who'd started as a clerk had become more essential to Whitmore Capital than the white heir who'd been groomed for leadership since birth. Preston stood abruptly. He couldn't sit in this office anymore, couldn't keep reviewing evidence that was making him feel sicker by the hour. He needed to talk to Naomi, needed to look her in the eye and understand what he'd actually done. 20 minutes later, he was in his car driving through D.C.'s Sunday evening quiet toward Georgetown. He didn't let himself think about whether this was appropriate, whether a CEO showing up at his suspended CFO's home was professional or wise or anything other than desperate. He just knew he couldn't wait until Monday. Couldn't face another night of growing certainty that he'd made a catastrophic mistake. The rain that had threatened all weekend finally arrived as he pulled up to her brownstone, one of the elegant row houses that lined Georgetown's historic streets, purchased with money she'd earned through decades of financial brilliance while he'd inherited his penthouse. Even their homes told the story of who'd worked for success and who'd simply received it. Preston stood on her doorstep in the rain, raising his hand to knock, feeling more uncertain than he had since his first day as CEO 15 years ago. The door opened before he could knock, but it wasn't Naomi. Malcolm Harrington stood in the doorway, 74 years old, and radiating the particular protectiveness of a father whose daughter had been wronged. His dark eyes assessed Preston with the kind of judgment that had nothing to do with wealth or position and everything to do with character. "Mr. Whitmore," Malcolm said, his voice carrying the precise courtesy of someone being polite, despite wanting to do otherwise. "This is a surprise. Sir, I need to speak with Naomi." Preston heard how he sounded, privileged, presumptuous, like he had any right to demand her time after what he'd done. Please, I think I made a mistake. You think? Malcolm's eyebrows rose. You humiliated my daughter in front of 40 people. You suspended her after 25 years of excellence without even asking for her side. You chose to believe the worst of her because it was easier than facing your own inadequacy. And now you show up wet and pretty and think that makes it right? Each word hit like a physical blow because they were true. All of it was true. I know I don't deserve, Preston started. Daddy, let him in. Both men turned. Naomi stood in the hallway, backlit by warm light from her living room. She was dressed for the weekend, jeans and an oversized Howard University sweatshirt that must have been her father's, her natural hair in a simple ponytail, no makeup, no armor. She looked younger than 48 and somehow more powerful than she'd ever looked in the boardroom. Malcolm didn't move. Baby girl, you don't have to. I know. Naomi's voice was gentle with her father, but her eyes on Preston were cool assessment. But I want to hear what he has to say. Malcolm stepped aside with obvious reluctance. Preston entered the brownstone, his first time inside despite 15 years of working together, and felt the weight of that fact. The living room was filled with evidence of Naomi's journey. Photos from her Howard graduation with Malcolm beaming beside her, awards for financial excellence, framed articles about her groundbreaking work, pictures with community organizations where she mentored young women of color. This was what she'd built from nothing, while Preston had inherited everything and nearly destroyed it. Sit, Naomi said, not an invitation but a command. She settled on the sofa with contained grace. Malcolm stood behind her like a sentry. Preston remained standing because sitting felt presumptuous. I suspended you because I was scared, he said, the words coming out raw and unplanned. Not because of the financials, because you challenged me in the board meeting 2 weeks ago about the European expansion, and you were right, and everyone knew you were right. Because for 15 years, you've been showing me exactly how mediocre my leadership is. Because, he took a breath, because admitting that I need you was harder than believing you were a threat. Naomi's expression didn't change. So you suspended me to protect your ego. Yes, no deflection, no excuses, just the truth. And now? Her voice was neutral, giving nothing away. You show up at my home on a Sunday night in the rain because I've spent the weekend reviewing the evidence and I think Thomas Ashford framed you. Because David made me see that the timestamps don't match your patterns, that the transactions were too obvious, that I was manipulated. Preston took a step closer, then stopped himself. Because I think I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to Whitmore Capital out of pride and insecurity, and I need you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. Do you? Naomi stood, and despite being several inches shorter than Preston, she filled the space with quiet power. Because I don't think you see it yet, not really. You see that you made a mistake about the evidence. You see that Thomas manipulated you. But do you see why it worked? Preston met her eyes. Because I wanted to believe it. Because you've been so busy protecting your father's legacy that you never built your own. Her voice wasn't cruel, just devastatingly honest. Because you've spent 15 years being a caretaker instead of a leader. Because when the board looks at quarterly reports, they see my strategies and your signature, and everyone knows it, including you. Yes, Preston said again, I see it. And what are you going to do about it? He wanted to say he'd fix everything, that he'd clear her name, terminate Thomas, promote her to COO, that he'd make her his equal partner in running the company. But standing in her living room with Malcolm's protective presence behind her and rain on the windows, Preston suddenly understood that whatever he offered wouldn't be enough. Because Naomi Harrington didn't need his permission or his position. She'd already decided what came next, and it wouldn't be returning as his CFO. I don't know, he admitted. Tell me what you want. What I want, Naomi said quietly, is for you to understand exactly what your arrogance cost you, what your insecurity cost me, what your inability to see past your own privilege cost this company. She moved closer, and Preston felt his pulse quicken despite everything. Tomorrow morning, you're going to learn that lesson. And then, Preston, you're going to have to decide who you actually want to be. She was close enough now that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, could smell the subtle scent of her shampoo. Close enough that his body responded despite the context, despite the professional distance they'd maintained for 15 years, despite every reason this was inappropriate. "I've been failing for 15 years, he said, voice low. "Not just professionally, personally. Because every time you walk into a board meeting, every time you challenge my decisions with that brilliant mind, every time you look at me like you're seeing exactly how inadequate I am." He stopped, took a breath. "All I can think about is how badly I want to kiss that mouth that destroys my arguments. How much I need you in ways that have nothing to do with quarterly reports and everything to do with the way you make me want to be better." Naomi's breath caught, almost imperceptibly, but she didn't move away. "You don't get to say that now," she said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "You don't get to show up here and confess feelings after you suspended me in front of 40 people. "I know." Preston's hands clenched at his sides to keep from reaching for her. "I know I have no right. I know I've destroyed any chance we might have had. But Naomi, you asked what I wanted, and the truth is, I want to earn the right to be someone you could trust, professionally and personally. I want to be the leader this company needs, the partner you deserve, the man who's worthy of your excellence." "Then tomorrow," Naomi said, stepping back and breaking the moment, "you're going to learn exactly what it takes to rebuild trust. And Preston, it's going to be harder than anything you've ever done." Malcolm appeared at her shoulder, protective and final. "Time to go, Mr. Whitmore." Preston nodded, understanding he'd been dismissed. He walked to the door, then turned back. Naomi was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Anger, calculation, and beneath it something that might have been regret for what they'd lost before they ever had it. "Naomi," he said, "whatever happens tomorrow, whatever you've planned, I deserved it. All of it." She didn't confirm or deny, just watched him walk out into the rain. Preston sat in his car outside her brownstone, engine, running, rain drumming on the roof. Tomorrow was suddenly terrifying in ways he didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. Naomi Harrington had spent the weekend planning something, and by Monday morning, nothing about Whitmore Capital would be the same. The takeover is coming, and Preston has no idea what's about to hit him. Don't miss the moment Naomi walks into that boardroom and changes everything. Keep listening to see how she owns not just his company, but his heart. Chapter 3. Preston Whitmore arrived at Whitmore Capital's offices at 7:15 a.m. Monday morning, coffee in hand, and prepared to salvage what remained of his credibility. He'd spent Sunday night after leaving Naomi's brownstone drafting his presentation, evidence clearing her name, documentation of Thomas Ashford's embezzlement, his plan to terminate Thomas and offer Naomi the COO position as apology. It wasn't enough. He knew that now. But it was a start, a way to acknowledge his mistake and begin rebuilding trust. His assistant met him at the elevator with an expression Preston couldn't quite read. "Sir, Mrs. Whitmore called an emergency board meeting for 8 a.m. Full attendance required." Preston's stomach dropped. "My mother called a meeting?" "Yes, sir. She invoked her authority as trustee. The board is already assembling." Preston walked to the executive conference room with growing dread. His mother only invoked trustee authority in situations of corporate emergency, and she'd specifically not told him about this meeting, which meant he pushed open the conference room doors and understood immediately that he'd walked into an ambush. The full board was assembled, 15 directors sitting at the long mahogany table, expressions ranging from uncomfortable to intrigued. Vivian sat at the head of the table, his father's seat, the position she'd inherited as trustee. Richard Hayes, the general counsel, sat beside her looking grim. Jordan Chen was there, despite being too junior for board meetings. And at the opposite end of the table, composed and devastating in a deep emerald power suit that made her look like she'd already won, Naomi Harrington. She met Preston's eyes across the boardroom with cool assessment. No anger, no triumph, just calm certainty that everything was about to change. "Preston, sit," Vivian said, not a request. He took his seat, mind racing. This wasn't about clearing Naomi's name. This was something else entirely. "Thank you all for attending on short notice," Vivian began. "I've called this emergency session because decisions must be made about Whitmore Capital's future." Preston, I understand you plan to present findings from your investigation into Ms. Harrington? Preston pulled out his folder, evidence of Thomas's embezzlement, the proof that Naomi had been framed. Yes, I've discovered that the allegations against Ms. Harrington were fabricated by Thomas Ashford to cover his own crimes. I'm prepared to clear her immediately. And that won't be necessary, Vivian interrupted, because Ms. Harrington has already conducted her own investigation. Naomi, would you present your findings? Naomi stood with fluid grace. She pressed a button on the conference room display, and the screen lit up with forensic documentation that made Preston's preliminary investigation look like amateur hour. Ladies and gentlemen, Naomi began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 25 years earning every word. Thomas Ashford has embezzled $3.2 million from legacy operations over 18 months. This documentation, prepared by forensic accountant Robert Chen, traces every transaction through shell companies and fabricated vendor contracts. Mr. Ashford then manipulated digital signatures to frame me for his crimes, timing his revelation to coincide with my restructuring proposal that would have closed his division and exposed the embezzlement. She advanced the slide. Email chains appeared. Thomas asking IT about credential access, Thomas planting seeds of doubt about Naomi to Preston, Thomas systematically building a framework to eliminate the threat she posed. Furthermore, Naomi continued, I have documentation from Vice President Jordan Chen showing Mr. Ashford's timeline manipulation and coordination with external parties to fabricate evidence. Jordan stood, clearly nervous but committed. I have email chains going back 6 weeks showing Thomas's preparation for framing Ms. Harrington. I'm prepared to testify to everything I've witnessed. Preston felt sick. This was worse than he'd thought, more systematic, more calculated, and he'd fallen for it completely because his ego had made him vulnerable to exactly this kind of manipulation. Thomas Ashford is terminated effective immediately, Vivian said. Security is escorting him from the building as we speak. She turned to Preston. The question now is what happens next. I'll offer Naomi the COO position, Preston said quickly. Full partnership in running the company, whatever it takes to... Preston. Vivian's voice was steel wrapped in maternal patience. Stop talking. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Preston's face flushed, but he closed his mouth. Naomi advanced to the next slide. Preston's breath caught. Performance data. Quarterly reports going back 5 years, with annotations showing where Preston had overruled her recommendations, where he'd ignored strategic proposals, where her contingency plans had compensated for his failures. The pattern was devastating. For 15 years, Naomi said, I have functioned as both CFO and de facto strategic officer for this company. I have compensated for conservative leadership that borders on paralysis. I have saved quarterly performances that would have otherwise failed. I have generated every major strategic initiative that's kept Whitmore Capital competitive. She turned to face Preston directly. The entire board watched. And when I submitted a comprehensive restructuring proposal that would transform this company from a legacy firm coasting on reputation into a lean, innovative operation positioned for sustainable growth. A proposal that every analysis shows would save 800 jobs and increase shareholder value by 30%. I was suspended. Without investigation, without conversation, without trust built over 25 years of excellence. The silence in the room was absolute. Vivian stood and the atmosphere shifted. This was no longer about clearing Naomi's name. This was about the company's future. My late husband created specific provisions in his trust structure, Vivian said, performance requirements that, if not met for 3 consecutive quarters, activate emergency measures allowing the board to transfer controlling interest to a party who can demonstrate superior capacity to restore performance. Preston's mouth went dry. Mother, Whitmore Capital has missed targets for 2 consecutive quarters, Vivian continued, and with your suspension of Ms. Harrington, the person who's been compensating for declining performance, we will certainly miss Q4. The emergency provisions activate in 6 weeks, unless we act now. She turned to the board. I am exercising my authority as trustee to invoke emergency measures immediately rather than waiting for the 3rd quarter failure. The trust provisions allow this in cases of demonstrated leadership crisis. This is a coup, Preston said, his voice harder than he intended. This is fiduciary responsibility, Vivian corrected. Something you've failed to demonstrate. Naomi advanced the presentation. Her restructuring proposal appeared, the one that had gotten her suspended, now elaborated with 5-year projections, market analysis, implementation timelines, and testimonials from board members she'd mentored over the years. It was brilliant. Preston had known that when he first saw it. He'd suspended her anyway because the proposal required closing legacy operations, his father's original division, the symbol of Whitmore family history, and admitting that tradition was killing the company's future. My proposal, Naomi said, positions Whitmore Capital to not only survive but lead in the emerging market landscape. It requires difficult decisions, but it saves jobs, increases value, and creates sustainable growth. The question for this board is simple. Do you want a company that honors the past while dying slowly, or one that builds on legacy while securing the future? Board member Carolyn Chen raised her hand. Ms. Harrington, are you proposing to take over as CEO? No. Naomi's answer was immediate and strategic. I'm proposing a restructured leadership model where I serve as board chair with controlling interest and voting authority. Preston remains CEO but reports to a strengthened board, real governance, real accountability, partnership instead of unchecked authority. The room erupted. In murmurs. Preston felt the ground shifting beneath him, not being fired, but being subordinated, made accountable. No longer the unchallenged heir, but an employee who had to earn his position. This is ridiculous, Thomas Sterling, one of the older board members, objected. You're asking us to hand control of the company to the person who's been running it for 15 years? Naomi interrupted smoothly. To the CFO who's generated every successful strategic initiative we've implemented? To the woman who saved quarterly performances while the CEO played caretaker? Her voice didn't rise, but the steel beneath was undeniable. Yes, Mr. Sterling, that's exactly what I'm proposing. David Martinez, Preston's friend and COO, spoke up. I support this. On the record, Naomi Harrington is the most strategically brilliant person I've worked with. If this vote is happening, I'm voting yes. Other voices joined. Board members Naomi had mentored, directors who'd watched her carry the company. One by one, the support built. Vivian called the vote. All in favor of transferring controlling interest and board chairmanship to Naomi Harrington under the emergency trust provisions, with Preston Whitmore remaining as CEO subject to board oversight. Hands rose. Preston watched, stunned, as 13 of 15 directors voted yes. The 2 dissents were older men who'd been his father's friends, voting out of loyalty rather than judgment. It was done. Democratically, legally, devastatingly done. The motion carries, Vivian said. Effective immediately, Naomi Harrington is board chair with controlling interest in Whitmore Capital. Preston Whitmore continues as CEO, reporting to the board. Thomas Ashford is terminated and will be referred for criminal prosecution. She looked at Preston with something that might have been sympathy beneath the steel. My son, you have a choice now. You can accept this with grace, learn from your mistakes, and become the leader this company needs, or you can fight it, lose badly, and destroy what remains of your reputation. Choose wisely. The board began to disperse. Jordan Chen approached Naomi first, relief and admiration on his young face. Thank you for letting me help. Thank you for choosing integrity, Naomi replied warmly. Your testimony mattered. Other board members congratulated her, shook her hand, pledged support. Preston sat at the conference table watching the woman he'd suspended 48 hours ago receive the authority he'd spent his life believing was his by birthright. And beneath the humiliation, beneath the shock, he felt something unexpected. Relief. Because Naomi Harrington was right. She'd been carrying him for 15 years, and maybe, finally, he could stop pretending otherwise and learn to actually lead instead of just inheriting. The boardroom emptied. Vivian was the last to leave, pausing to touch Naomi's shoulder with approval and Preston's with complex maternal feeling before closing the door behind her. Naomi and Preston remained, alone in the boardroom where 72 hours ago he'd suspended her. The morning light through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast everything in sharp relief. You planned this, Preston said, not an accusation. an observation. The whole weekend, while I was reviewing evidence and having realizations, you were building a corporate takeover. I executed what your arrogance made necessary, Naomi corrected, beginning to pack her materials. You suspended me without investigation, without trust, without even a conversation. What did you think would happen? I thought, Preston stood, moved closer. I didn't think. That's the problem. I reacted out of ego and insecurity instead of actual leadership. Yes, she didn't soften it. You did. Naomi, look at me. He waited until her dark eyes met his. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm just asking. Tell me you see that I understand now. What I did. What I've been doing for 15 years. How completely I failed you in this company. She studied him with that assessing gaze that had always made him feel simultaneously exposed and more seen than he'd ever been. I see that you're starting to understand. Whether that understanding translates to actual change remains to be proven. Then let me prove it. Preston took another step closer, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had been between them for years, the one he'd been too cowardly to acknowledge. Let me show you that I can be the leader this company needs, the partner you deserve. Let me earn back what I destroyed. Partners implies equality, Preston. Her voice dropped, became something more personal than professional. Are you prepared for what that actually means? Me making final decisions, you implementing my strategy? The world watching a black woman give orders to the white heir? Yes, no hesitation. Because here's what I learned this weekend, Naomi. I don't just need you professionally. I need you in ways that terrify me. The way your mind works, your integrity, your refusal to accept mediocrity, the way you've been making me want to be better for years and I was too proud to admit it. His voice roughened. I've been half in love with you for so long, I can't remember when it started. And I sabotaged us because admitting I need you, personally, professionally, completely, was harder than being a mediocre CEO coasting on my father's name. Naomi's breath caught, just slightly. You don't get to confess feelings now. You don't get to show up with pretty words after what you did. I know. Preston's hands clenched at his sides, fighting the urge to reach for her. I know I destroyed any chance before we ever had one. But you asked me yesterday what I wanted. And the truth is, I want to earn the right to be someone you could trust. Someone you could let in. Someone worthy of the brilliant, beautiful, powerful woman who just took over my company because I was too stupid to see what I had. The tension between them was visible, electric, entirely inappropriate for a boardroom and impossible to hide. Naomi's pulse visibly quickened at her throat. Preston saw the moment she felt it too, the pull that had been building for years finally acknowledged. You report to me now, she said, voice steady despite the awareness between them. At work, I have final say. You implement my vision, you support my leadership, you rebuild trust through action, not words. Yes, Preston said immediately. And if I decide you've earned it, when I'm ready to explore what this is between us, it happens on my timeline, my terms, with the understanding that I control the pace and the boundaries. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel her presence like heat. Can you handle that, Preston? Real partnership means surrendering the control you've always assumed was yours by birthright. His heart hammered against his ribs. I'll handle whatever you need me to handle. I'll be patient. I'll prove myself. I'll spend every day showing you that I can be the man and the leader you deserve beside you. Then we have an understanding. Naomi's hand came up, just briefly, to straighten his tie, the casual intimacy of the gesture nearly undoing him. You get one chance to prove you've changed. One. Don't waste it. She gathered her materials and walked to the door. Preston watched her move with that contained power that filled every space she entered. At the doorway, she turned back. Welcome to the new Whitmore Capital, Mr. Whitmore, where excellence matters more than legacy and partnership means actual equality. Her smile was sharp and satisfied and absolutely devastating. Try to keep up. Then she was gone, leaving Preston alone in the boardroom that was now hers, with his company reshaped around him and his entire future dependent on learning to follow the lead of the woman he'd been stupid enough to suspend. It was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Chapter 4. 6 weeks later, Naomi Harrington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new corner office, the one that had been Preston's, his father's, his grandfather's before, watching the December sunset paint DC in shades of gold and amber. The city spread below her like a promise kept. Behind her, Preston entered without knocking, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the slightly rumpled look of someone who'd been working 18-hour days trying to keep up with her strategic vision. He looked exhausted and more alive than he had in years. "The Jennings merger closed," he reported, setting her coffee on the desk the way he'd learned she liked it. "They signed off on all our terms. Jordan's already implementing the integration plan you designed." "Good." Naomi took the coffee, let her fingers brush his briefly, deliberate, testing, seeing his immediate response. "What about the legacy operations closure?" "Complete. We retained 82% of the workforce through redeployment. Better than projected." Preston's pride in delivering on her strategy was genuine. "Naomi, your restructuring plan is working. Stock price is up 17%. Board sentiment is overwhelmingly positive. You're being profiled in Forbes, WSJ, Bloomberg. Everyone wants to know how you turned around a legacy firm in 6 weeks." "We turned it around," she corrected, meeting his eyes. "Partnership, Preston. You've been implementing flawlessly." Something shifted in his expression at the acknowledgement. Over the past 6 weeks, Preston had shown up every single day, proving himself, implementing her strategies without ego, supporting her leadership publicly, learning to follow her vision while finding his own voice within it, slowly becoming the leader he'd always had the potential to be if he'd been willing to set aside inherited authority and earn actual respect. And the attraction between them had only intensified, building with every late-night strategy session, every shared victory, every moment where his deference felt less like defeat and more like the kind of partnership that made them both more powerful. "There's a board dinner tonight," Preston said, "celebrating the quarterly results. You should wear that midnight blue dress from the investor meeting, the one that makes me forget every word I've ever known." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "That's inappropriate workplace commentary, Mr. Whitmore." "Is it?" He moved closer, his voice dropping. "Because I've spent 6 weeks being the perfect subordinate, following your lead, implementing your vision, proving I could be trusted. And Naomi, you told me when you were ready to explore this, it would be on your terms." Another step, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Are you ready?" Her pulse quickened. She'd been testing him for weeks. Small touches, lingering looks, moments of deliberate proximity to see if he'd presume or if he'd wait for her permission. He'd waited. Every single time. Letting her set the pace, surrendering control, proving that partnership meant trusting her judgment in everything. "The dinner starts at 7, Naomi said, "which gives us approximately 20 minutes. 20 minutes for what?" His breath caught as she stepped even closer. "To establish new boundaries." Her hand came up to his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. "When we leave this building tonight, Preston, I'm not your boss. I'm the woman you've been wanting for years. And when we're alone, when we're away from board meetings and strategy sessions and corporate structures, you get to show me exactly what that means." Naomi. Her name on his lips was reverence and hunger and absolute devotion. The kiss happened against the windows overlooking DC. 6 weeks of tension finally released, professional boundaries dissolving into something far more personal and incandescent. His hands were careful, waiting for her permission before moving lower. She granted it by pulling him closer, taking what she wanted, setting the pace. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Preston's forehead rested against hers. "I love you," he said, "not just because of this, because of who you are, your brilliance, your integrity, the way you lead with both strength and grace. I love you, and I'll spend every day proving I deserve you." "Then prove it," Naomi said, straightening his tie with a smile that promised later. "Starting with helping me run this company into greatness. Partnership, Preston, in everything." "Partnership," he agreed, "in everything." They left for the board dinner side by side. Her the chair, him the CEO, both of them exactly where they were supposed to be. Building something that honored legacy while creating the future. Choosing each other with full knowledge of cost and worth. Equal partners in business and life, rewriting the rules together. And Naomi Harrington, who'd started as a clerk and ended as owner, smiled at the city below and knew she'd won more than a company. She'd won her future, on her terms, completely. They've conquered the professional battlefield, but can their partnership survive when Preston has to prove his love matches his words? Stay with us until the very end to see if these two powerful people can build something that honors both excellence and heart.